But in the midst of all this, Richard McGregor is with us. He's a journalist and former Beijing bureau chief with the Financial Times. He's the author of the new book, Asia's Reckoning, China, Japan, and the Fate of U.S. Power in the Pacific Century. You can, you can tweet him at McGregor, MC, Gregor, Richard. And Richard McGregor, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for joining us. So your book, China, Japan, and the Fate of U.S. Power in the Pacific Century. Some fascinating stuff here. What, you talk in particular about the history wars. What are the history wars?
Well, I think anybody living in America should be familiar with history wars. Look what happened in Charlottesville recently. It takes a long time to sort of cleanse politics of history. In fact, sometimes it never leaves. And East Asia's got their own big history wars, and that's really about Japan's invasion of China in the 30s, the war in the 40s, whether Japan apologized, whether they were sincere, whether China actually doesn't care if they apologize, but just uses history as leverage in politics. And it's something which has permeated their relationship for, 70 years. And it's very consequential, right? These are the second and third biggest economies in the world. In 10 years, China will probably be the biggest. And the whole global economy runs through these countries. And their inability to sort of get to a sort of a peaceful place on history makes it a very dangerous relationship.
There's a theory of history that war comes about, sometimes revolution, but typically just war, when one regionally dominant power loses the ability to assert that dominance and is replaced by another regional power, or a worldwide power for that matter. There are arguments that this is what informed both World War I and World War II and others, going way back in history. Do you subscribe to that notion, and do you see that kind of dynamic at play here? And if so, is it the U.S. Economically dominating Southeast Asia or Asia, or is it Japan post-World War II?
That's, I think, to use the big words, this theory's got a lot of play recently. It's about, the inevitability of a rising superpower falling into conflict with the established superpower, and that's the U.S. and China.
Right.
The so-called Thucydides trap, if I pronounce
Yes,
that
Thucydides,
correctly.
yes. Thank you.
I got a kind of slightly different take on that. I think the dangers, there is that danger, obviously. The U.S. and China are on a collision course. That's the bad news. The good news is that they know that, and they try to manage it. But there's another thing that Greek writer came up with, and that's about it's dangerous to build an empire. It's even more dangerous to let it go. And I reckon that slightly describes better U.S. dilemma in Asia, because the U.S. is a kind of imperial power in East Asia. It has troops in Japan and South Korea 70 years after the war was won. But if they left, there would be a vacuum, potentially chaotic. It's why Japan and South Korea don't want the U.S. to leave, because they don't trust the country that would fill that vacuum, China. And I kind of think we're at a turning point now, because, China wants to be the dominant power in Asia, and their sort of sentiment is, thank you, America, you can go home now.
Right. And you open the book with a fascinating analysis of how frustrated President Obama was with President Hu, and how pleased, apparently, he was with President Xi, in that Hu was, the previous Chinese president, was relatively impenetrable. He never shared what he was thinking and whatnot. Xi is much more proactive and like that. To what extent is Chinese politics and our interaction with Chinese, and the world's interaction with Chinese politics, personality dependent versus, 5-year plan, Communist Party has decided this, that, or the other thing dependent?
It's a very good question. Because Hu Jintao, who was the previous Chinese leader, was a very sort of bland individual, kind of charisma-free zone, if you like. Nobody could really get anything out of him other than largely scripted comments. Xi Jinping is a very different person, decisive, outspoken, quite aggressive. He's a risk-taker as well. And I think, so the personalities do matter. But I think the objective situation matters as well. China was not so powerful 10, 12 years ago, 15 years ago when Hu Jintao took over. When Xi Jinping took over, he was in charge of a much more powerful country, so he had much more room to move. And I think Chinese aims and policies have kind of been pretty consistent, and that now they've really got the capabilities, military capabilities, economic leverage to get what they want. So, I think that's probably the bigger trend.
Yeah. There's a narrative that I know two people in the White House have been sharing with the president at some length, because I know them, that basically the United States climbed to industrial and international preeminence by copying the Tudor plan that had been put into place in England in the 14th or 15th century, which was basically a mercantilist plan that the Brits stole from the Dutch, and that they reinvented from the ancient Greeks and Romans, and that China has just kind of beat us at our own game. That China, starting 30 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, decided to go in this mercantilist direction, protecting their own economy and exploiting the availability of other people's economies. And that the only way to fight mercantilism is by doubling down on mercantilism, and that's the border adjusted trade, or the border adjustment taxes and tariffs and things like this. To what extent do you think that kind of thinking actually pervades the thinking with the U.S., China, Japan, and what do you think of it?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I mean, there's no doubt that all countries at different times have been protectionist, and there's no doubt that in some cases they've been big winners from that. I mean, I'll tell you, South Korea and Japan were much more protectionist than China, than China was. China's kind of getting protectionist now. China needed to open up quickly at when they decided to have a more market-based economy. They needed to open up quickly, but now that they've sort of caught up, they're sort of thinking, okay, well, they are becoming more protectionist. I mean, it's a little bit true that, the U.S., China is doing just what the U.S. did to the U.K. in the 19th century, but it's a bit different in this respect. Modern economies, the ability to steal, the value of stealing technology, the ability to sort of spread that technology, replicate it, benefit from it, I think is vastly greater these days than it was in the 19th century, and therefore the act of theft is much more damaging these days. And I think the U.S. has got a very fair beef with China in stealing IP and protecting its own markets and tech companies and the like. It's the sort of thing I think Trump should be focused on rather than steal.
Yes.
I would hope it would go like that rather than doubling down on mercantilism, because that I think that would be bad for everybody else.
Yeah, it's a very interesting time we live in, and I wish we had more time for this. I'd love to get into the North Korea thing, but I know you have to go at 15 after. It's a brilliant book, Asia's Reckoning: China, Japan, and the Fate of U.S. Power in the Pacific Century. The author, Richard McGregor, and available from all your typical book sources. Richard, thank you so much for being with us.
I appreciate it. Thank you.